There's nothing quite like eating dinner alone at a table meant for six, night after night, year after year. Wade Langston knew that emptiness well, the kind that money can't fill and success can't heal. At 52, the wealthy rancher had built an empire on Montana's rolling hills, but his big house felt more like a tomb than a home. When his cook quit without warning, Wade needed someone fast. He posted a simple ad: "Cook wanted, good pay, quiet ranch." What showed up was Miss Alma Whitfield, 70 years old, with silver hair and gentle eyes that seemed to see right through him. She came with one worn suitcase and a lifetime of cooking for church dinners. Wade thought he was hiring someone to fix his meals. He had no idea she might just fix his broken heart. Could this kind woman be the family he never knew he needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in Wade Langston's foyer chimed 6 times, its brass pendulum catching the first rays of Montana sunrise that streamed through the tall windows. Wade was already dressed and nursing his second cup of black coffee, standing at the kitchen window that overlooked 30,000 acres of prime cattle country. The view should have filled him with satisfaction: rolling pastures dotted with black Angus cattle, the distant peaks of the crazy mountains painted purple in the dawn light, and closer to the house, the sprawling network of barns and outbuildings that housed one of the most successful ranching operations in the state. Instead, Wade felt the familiar weight of solitude pressing down on his shoulders like a heavy winter coat he couldn't take off. The kitchen around him was a monument to money well spent, but poorly lived in granite countertops that had rarely seen a home-cooked meal, stainless steel appliances that gleamed from lack of use, and a breakfast nook with windows facing east where he'd eaten exactly 3 meals in the past year. Most mornings found him standing exactly where he was now, drinking coffee and watching the ranch come alive, while he remained somehow separate from it all. His foreman, Miguel Santos, was already moving between the barns, his weathered hands gesturing as he directed the younger hands to their morning tasks. Miguel had worked the Langston land for 22 years, first under Wade's grandfather, and then transitioning to Wade when the old man passed. If anyone understood the isolation that seemed to seep from the bones of the big house, it was Miguel. He'd watched Wade grow from a boy who helped with the cattle to a man who owned them all but seemed to belong to none of it. Wade's fingers found the chain of his grandfather's pocket watch, worn smooth from decades of handling. He pulled it from his vest pocket and opened the silver case. The delicate hands showed 6:07 a.m., and underneath them the inscription his grandmother had engraved 50 years ago still caught the light. "Time spent with family is worth every second." The irony wasn't lost on him. Time was the one thing Wade had in abundance, but family, real family, had slipped through his fingers like water through a sieve. His grandfather, James Langston, had built the ranch from nothing in the 1942, starting with 100 head of cattle and a vision bigger than the Montana sky. The old man had understood something Wade was still learning, that success meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. But James had been blessed with a wife who loved the land as much as he did, and together they'd raised 5 children in the rambling farmhouse that Wade had torn down and replaced with this modern monument to loneliness. The new house was everything the old one wasn't: climate-controlled, electronically secured, and completely isolated from the life of the ranch. 8 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a library he never used, and a formal dining room where dust collected on crystal glasses that hadn't held wine since the housewarming party 7 years ago. Wade had built it with dreams of filling it with a family of his own, but 3 failed engagements had taught him a hard lesson. Women were drawn to his money, not his heart, and he'd lost the ability to tell the difference. The last cook had lasted 8 months, a taciturn man named Carson, who prepared adequate meals and spoke only when spoken to. Wade had preferred it that way: simple transactions, clear boundaries, No messy emotional complications. When Carson left 2 weeks ago to care for his ailing mother in Billings, Wade had felt relief mixed with dread. Relief because he wouldn't have to make small talk over breakfast anymore, and dread because he'd have to find someone else to invade his carefully controlled space. His coffee had grown cold while he stood lost in thought. Wade poured it out and refilled his cup from the expensive machine that ground beans and brewed perfect coffee at the touch of a button. Everything in his life worked perfectly, functioned exactly as designed, and left him feeling utterly empty. At exactly 8 a.m., his phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. "Boss, the lady for the cook job is here. Should I send her up to the house?" Wade had almost forgotten. Yesterday's phone call had been brief, a woman with a soft voice and proper grammar asking about the position. He'd told her to come by this morning, expecting someone young, looking for temporary work, or an older woman desperate enough to take a job in the middle of nowhere. He hadn't expected to feel nervous about the interview. "Send her up," he texted back, then immediately regretted it. He should have met her at the barns, kept the house off limits until he was sure about her. But it was too late now. 10 minutes later, Wade heard the soft knock at the front door. He'd been pacing the kitchen, straightening items that were already straight, trying to decide how to handle this interview. Be professional but not warm. Lay out clear expectations. Make it obvious this was a business arrangement, nothing more. He opened the door and found himself looking down into the kindest eyes he'd seen in years. Miss Alma Whitfield was exactly 70 years old, as she'd mentioned on the phone, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and hands that showed decades of honest work. She wore a simple blue dress with a cardigan draped over her shoulders, and she carried a worn leather suitcase that looked like it had travelled many miles. "Mr. Langston," she said, extending a firm handshake. "I'm Alma Whitfield. Thank you for seeing me. Miss Whitfield." Wade stepped aside to let her in, watching as she took in the spacious foyer with its marble floors and crystal chandelier. Her expression remained neutral, but he caught something in her eyes, not judgment exactly, but assessment. "It's a beautiful home," she said simply. "Very grand." Wade led her to the kitchen, where they sat at the small table by the windows. Outside, the ranch continued its morning rhythm, but inside, time seemed to slow down. Alma folded her hands in her lap and waited patiently while Wade tried to remember the questions he'd planned to ask. "Tell me about your experience," he finally managed. "I've been cooking for church suppers and community gatherings for 30 years, Alma said. "Before that, I cooked for my husband and raised 3 children who never went hungry and never complained about their vegetables." Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth. "I can cook for 1 person or 100. I keep a clean kitchen, and I mind my own business." "The job pays well," Wade said, naming a figure that made most people's eyes light up. Alma simply nodded as if good pay was expected, not surprising. "The position includes room and board," Wade continued. "There's a small apartment above the garage that's fully furnished. I usually eat breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, and dinner at 6. I prefer simple meals, nothing fancy." "Simple is what I do best," Alma replied. "Might I ask what happened to your previous cook?" "Family emergency. He had to leave suddenly." Alma studied Wade's face for a moment, and he had the uncomfortable sensation that she was seeing more than he intended to show. "Cooking is more than just putting food on a plate," she said quietly. "A good meal feeds more than the body. It feeds the soul. Are you looking for someone to just put food on a plate, Mr. Langston? Or are you looking for someone who understands that a kitchen is the heart of a home?" The question caught Wade off guard. He'd expected to discuss schedules and meal preferences, not philosophy. "I'm looking for someone reliable," he said carefully. "That I am," Alma said. "But reliability comes in many forms. I'm reliable about keeping a clean kitchen and cooking nutritious meals. I'm also reliable about treating people with respect and expecting the same in return. I don't tolerate drinking during working hours or inappropriate behavior. I say grace before meals, and I'll expect you to respect that even if you don't participate. And if you're the kind of man who thinks hiring help gives you the right to be unkind, then we should end this conversation right now. Wade felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite name. When was the last time someone had spoken to him with such gentle firmness? When had anyone set boundaries with him that weren't about money or contracts? "I'm not unkind," he said, and realized as he said it that he wasn't entirely sure if that was true. "Good," Alma said, smiling for the first time since she'd arrived. The smile transformed her face, revealing laugh lines and a warmth that seemed to fill the kitchen. "Then I think we'll get along just fine. When would you like me to start?" Wade found himself saying tomorrow before he'd consciously decided to hire her. Something about Alma Whitfield made him feel like he was 7 years old again, sitting in his grandmother's kitchen while she made biscuits and told him stories about his grandfather's younger days. It was a feeling he'd forgotten he could have. "Tomorrow it is," Alma said, rising from her chair with a grace that spoke of a lifetime of purposeful movement. "I'll plan to have breakfast ready at 7 sharp. Is there anything you particularly don't like?" "I'm not picky," Wade said, walking her to the door. "Just simple. You mentioned that." Alma paused on the front step and looked back at the house, then at Wade. "Mr. Langston, if you don't mind me saying so, this is a beautiful place, but it feels a little lonely. Sometimes the best remedy for that is a good meal shared with good company." Wade watched her walk down the gravel drive toward her small Honda Civic, the worn suitcase bumping gently against her leg. Miguel met her halfway and pointed toward the apartment above the garage, and Wade saw him tip his hat respectfully as they talked. Even his foreman, who was suspicious of everyone, seemed charmed by the silver-haired woman with the direct gaze. That evening, Wade ate a microwave dinner standing at the kitchen counter, looking out at the apartment where a single light glowed in the window. For the first time in months, he found himself curious about tomorrow morning. What would Alma cook for breakfast? How would it feel to have the smell of real food coming from his kitchen again? As he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, Wade paused to look at the grandfather clock. The brass pendulum caught the light from the chandelier, and he could almost hear his grandfather's voice. "Time spent with family is worth every second." Maybe, Wade thought, family wasn't always the people you were born to. Maybe sometimes it was the people who chose to stay. Wade woke at 5:30 a.m. to a sound he hadn't heard in his kitchen for years, someone humming. The melody drifted up through the vents, soft and sweet, weaving through the pre-dawn quiet like a gentle benediction. He lay still for a moment, trying to place the tune. It was something old, something his grandmother might have hummed while she kneaded bread dough on Sunday mornings. By the time he dressed and made his way downstairs, the kitchen had been transformed. The cold, institutional space he'd eaten microwave dinners in for 2 weeks had somehow become warm and welcoming. Sunlight streamed through windows that sparkled from a thorough cleaning, and the granite countertops held evidence of real cooking flour dusted across the surface. A wooden spoon resting in a ceramic bowl, and the rich aroma of coffee that actually smelled like coffee instead of the bitter brew his expensive machine usually produced. Alma stood at the stove, her silver hair catching the morning light, wearing a simple apron over her blue dress. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and her smile was as warm as the kitchen itself. "Good morning, Mr. Langston," she said, as if they'd been sharing mornings for years, instead of this being her first day. "I hope you don't mind that I started a little early. I like to have everything ready when folks wake up hungry." "It smells incredible," Wade said, and realized he meant it. The last time his kitchen had smelled like food instead of disinfectant, his grandfather had still been alive. "Biscuits and gravy, scrambled eggs with fresh chives from the herb garden I noticed by the back door, and bacon that I bought from Miller's farm in town yesterday." Alma moved with practiced efficiency, transferring golden biscuits from the oven to a cloth-lined basket. "I hope that suits you. If there's something else you prefer for breakfast, just let me know." Wade took his usual seat at the small table, but instead of eating alone while staring out at the ranch, he found himself watching Alma work. She moved through his kitchen as if she'd been doing it for decades, opening cabinets and drawers with the confidence of someone who understood that a kitchen was meant to be used, not admired. "I found this tucked behind the flour canister," Alma said, setting a worn leather book on the counter. "Looks like it might have belonged to the previous cook, but the writing looks too feminine and too old for that." Wade's breath caught. The recipe book was small and thick, its leather cover darkened with age and handling. He knew what it was, before he even opened it. His grandmother's collection of family recipes, written in her careful script on pages, yellowed with time and kitchen accidents. "That's not Carson's," Wade said quietly, taking the book with hands that weren't quite steady. He opened to the first page and saw his grandmother's name, Elizabeth Langston, written in fading blue ink. Below it, in a younger hand, was an inscription. "For my dear granddaughter-in-law, whoever she may be, may these recipes bring as much love to your table as they brought to mine." Wade had forgotten the book existed. His grandmother had left it in the kitchen when she moved to the nursing home 15 years ago, and it had somehow survived 3 different renovations and countless cleanings by forgettable housekeepers. "She must have been a wonderful cook," Alma said softly, setting a plate in front of him. The biscuits were golden and flaky, the gravy rich and creamy, and the eggs were exactly the way he remembered his grandmother, making them fluffy and light, with just a hint of butter. Wade took a bite and felt something shift inside his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced during Alma's interview, but stronger now. The food didn't just taste good, it tasted like memory, like Sunday mornings when the house was full of family and love instead of empty rooms and silence. "She was," Wade said, his voice rougher than he intended, "my grandmother. This was her recipe book." Alma sat down across from him with her own plate, and Wade noticed she bowed her head for a moment before picking up her fork. A quiet prayer, he realized, said with the same natural ease as breathing. "These are," Alma said after tasting them. The recipe was marked with a star and had notes in the margins. "Extra butter makes them tender, and don't overwork the dough. Good advice for biscuits and for life." Wade found himself smiling, the first genuine smile he'd felt in weeks. She used to say that cooking was the way women took care of the people they loved. Even when words failed, a good meal could say what needed saying. "Smart woman," Alma said. "What was her name?" "Elizabeth, but everyone called her Beth." Wade flipped through the pages of recipes, seeing notes written in different hands, his grandmother's careful script, his mother's hurried scrawl, even his own childish printing from the summer he'd helped make cookies for the church bake sale. "These recipes have been well loved," Alma observed, pointing to pages stained with flour and vanilla extract, margins filled with modifications and improvements. "A recipe book like this is more than just instructions for cooking. It's a family history." Wade stopped at a page titled Beth's Sunday Pot Roast and felt his throat tighten. His grandmother had made that pot roast every Sunday for 40 years, and the smell of it cooking had meant family dinner, loud conversations around the big oak table, and the certainty that he belonged somewhere. "I haven't thought about these recipes in years," Wade admitted. "After she passed, I just wanted to put it all behind me. Start fresh, you know." Alma studied his face with those knowing eyes. "Starting fresh is one thing. Forgetting where you came from is something else entirely." The observation was gentle but pointed, and Wade felt exposed in a way that money and success had protected him from for years. Here was this woman he'd known for less than 24 hours, seeing things he'd hidden from business partners and lawyers, and even himself. "My family wasn't," Wade began, then stopped. How could he explain the complicated legacy of the Langston name, the grandfather who'd built an empire but died lonely, The father who'd inherited land, but not the ability to love it. The mother who'd left when Wade was 12 because she couldn't stand the isolation anymore. Families are complicated, Alma said simply, but that doesn't mean we throw away the good parts along with the bad. Wade looked at the recipe book again, at his grandmother's careful notes and loving modifications. What would you say if I asked you to cook from this book sometimes? Not every day, just when you feel like it. Alma's smile was radiant. I'd say it would be an honor. There's nothing I love more than cooking recipes that have been tested by time and seasoned with love. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that felt peaceful instead of empty. Wade found himself reluctant to leave for his morning rounds, wanting to stay in the warm kitchen where his grandmother's recipes lived again, and Alma's humming made the house feel like a home. "Mr. Langston," Alma said as he prepared to leave, "about dinner tonight, would you mind if I cook something from the recipe book? There's a beef stew recipe that looks perfect for a cool evening like this." Wade felt his chest tighten again, but not with sadness this time, with something that felt dangerously like hope. That sounds perfect. As he walked toward the barns, Wade could hear Alma humming again, the same melody that had woken him that morning. He realized he'd been holding his breath for 2 weeks, maybe longer, and for the first time since Carson left, he was looking forward to coming home for dinner. Behind him, the kitchen window glowed with warm light, and Wade caught sight of Alma at the sink, the recipe book open beside her as she planned the evening meal. For a moment, just a moment, the big house looked like what he'd always dreamed it could be. Not just a showcase for his success, but a real home where someone was waiting for him to return. 3 days later, Wade found himself lingering over breakfast, longer than he had since he was a boy. Alma's beef stew had been everything he'd hoped for, and more rich and savory, exactly the way his grandmother used to make it. But more than the food, it was the atmosphere Alma created that kept him anchored to the kitchen table each morning. She moved through his space with a quiet confidence that somehow made the enormous house feel less empty. Wade had established a routine of professional distance. He thanked her for meals, discussed any scheduling conflicts, and kept conversations focused on the practical aspects of running the household. It was working perfectly until the morning he came downstairs to find Alma standing in the hallway outside his office, holding a dust cloth and staring at something on the wall. "I'm sorry," she said when she noticed him watching. "I was dusting the picture frames, and I couldn't help but notice." Wade's stomach dropped. He'd forgotten about the photograph Alma had discovered, half hidden behind a larger landscape painting. It was a simple 8x10 frame containing the last picture taken of his family together, Wade at 16, gangly and serious, standing between his parents in front of the original ranch house. His father's hand rested on Wade's shoulder, and his mother was actually smiling, one of the few times the camera had caught her looking happy on Langston land. "That's not," Wade began, then stopped. What was he going to say? That it wasn't important? That it didn't belong there? "You don't need to dust in my office." "Of course," Alma said quietly, but she didn't move away from the photograph. "It's just, you look so young here, and your parents, they look proud of you." Wade felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the defensive wall that had protected him for decades starting to rise. "That was a long time ago. Not so long that it stopped mattering," Alma said, her voice gentle but firm. "Why is it hidden away like something shameful?" The question hit harder than Wade expected. He'd moved the photograph after his mother left, unable to bear the reminder of what his family had been before it all fell apart. For 25 years, it had lived in shadows, gathering dust behind more acceptable images of landscapes and cattle. "Because some things are better left in the past," Wade said, his voice sharper than he intended. Alma studied his face with those knowing eyes, and Wade felt exposed again. "Mr. Langston, I don't mean to pry into your personal business, but I've been keeping house for families my whole adult life. I know the difference between a home where people are loved and one where people are hiding. You've been here 3 days." Wade said defensively. 3 days is long enough to see that you're living like a man serving a sentence instead of a man enjoying his blessings, Alma replied. This house has everything money can buy except the one thing that matters most. Wade wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he was perfectly content with his life, that he didn't need her psychological insights along with her cooking. But standing there in the hallway with his family's ghost staring down at them, he couldn't find the words to make the lie convincing. "What do you know about my family?" Wade asked, and immediately regretted the question. He didn't want to hear Alma's analysis of his childhood, didn't want her sympathy or her solutions. "I know that your grandfather built this ranch with love, and that love is still in the land, even if it's not in this house anymore," Alma said simply. "I know that your parents are in this picture, which means they existed and they mattered, even if they're not here now. And I know that you're living like a man who's afraid that caring about anything will hurt too much to bear." The accuracy of her observation hit Wade like a physical blow. How could this woman he barely knew see so clearly what he'd spent decades hiding from business associates, lawyers, and even himself? "My mother left when I was 12. Wade heard himself saying, the words coming out before he could stop them. Said she couldn't stand the isolation anymore, couldn't stand living in the middle of nowhere with people who cared more about cattle than conversation. My father. He stopped, unwilling to voice the rest of the story. "Your father blamed you," Alma said quietly, "and it wasn't a question." Wade nodded, surprised by the relief he felt at having someone else speak the truth he'd carried alone for so long. He said, "If I'd been a better son, maybe she wouldn't have needed to leave. If I'd been more interesting, more like the city boys she'd grown up with, maybe she would have stayed." "And you believed him." "I was 12. What else was I supposed to believe?" Alma was quiet for a long moment, and Wade realized she was angry, not at him, but for him. He could see it in the way she held her shoulders, in the slight tightening around her eyes. A grown man who puts that kind of burden on a child is a man who doesn't understand the first thing about being a father, she said finally. "Your mother's leaving wasn't about you, and it certainly wasn't your responsibility to fix." Wade felt something crack open inside his chest, some long-sealed chamber where he'd stored 30 years of guilt and self-blame. Maybe not. But the result was the same. She left. He drank himself to death within 5 years. And I learned that caring too much about people just gives them the power to destroy you. So, you decided to stop caring. I decided to be self-sufficient. "There's a difference between self-sufficient and self-isolated," Alma said gently. "One is strength, the other is just fear, wearing a fancy suit." Wade wanted to argue with her, to defend the walls he'd built so carefully over the years. But looking at the photograph of his 16-year-old self, hopeful and trusting and still believing that families could last, he felt tired of carrying the weight of other people's failures. "The picture stays where it is," he said finally. Alma nodded and moved the dust cloth to the frame, carefully cleaning the glass until the image was clear and bright. "It's a good picture," she said. "You have your grandfather's eyes, strong and kind, even when they're trying to be hard." Wade left for his morning rounds with Alma's words echoing in his mind, strong and kind, even when they're trying to be hard. When was the last time someone had called him kind? When was the last time he'd allowed himself to be kind without worrying about the consequences? That evening, over dinner prepared from another one of his grandmother's recipes, Wade found himself asking Alma about her own family, her own losses. It was the first personal question he'd asked since she'd arrived, and when she answered with stories of a marriage that lasted 43 years and children who called every Sunday, Wade felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, curiosity about another person's happiness instead of skepticism about their motives. For the first time since his mother left, Wade went to bed thinking that maybe, just maybe, letting someone see his pain wouldn't necessarily lead to more of it. The following Sunday morning, Wade woke to the sound of silence. For a week, Alma's humming had become his natural alarm clock, but today the house was quiet in a way that felt wrong. He dressed quickly and went downstairs, expecting to find her in the kitchen preparing breakfast as usual. Instead, he found a note propped against the coffee pot. "Gone to church. Breakfast is in the warming drawer. Back by noon. Wade felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. The kitchen, without Alma's presence, seemed to revert to its former sterile state, despite the lingering aroma of fresh biscuits and the warm light streaming through clean windows. He ate alone, realizing how quickly he'd grown accustomed to sharing his morning meal with quiet conversation and gentle observations about the weather or the ranch. At 11:30, Wade found himself watching the driveway for Alma's small Honda. When it pulled up to the garage apartment, he was surprised by his own relief. Through the kitchen window, he watched her climb the stairs to her apartment, moving with the careful dignity of someone who dressed for church and wanted to change into comfortable clothes before starting lunch. 20 minutes later, she knocked softly on the back door, carrying a small stack of mail and what appeared to be a church bulletin. "The mailbox was full," she said, handing him the letters. "I hope you don't mind that I brought it up." "Thank you," Wade said, noticing that she'd changed into a simple house dress and that her silver hair was slightly mussed from removing whatever hat she'd worn to church. "How was the service?" "Peaceful," Alma replied, then paused as if considering whether to say more. "Pastor Williams asked about you, actually. Said he remembered your grandfather fondly and wondered if you might visit sometime." Wade felt the familiar defensive response rising in his chest. "I'm not much of a churchgoer." "Neither was my husband when we first met," Alma said, moving to the refrigerator to begin preparing lunch. "He said he could worship God just fine from his fishing boat, thank you very much." Her smile was soft with memory. "Took me 2 years to convince him that sometimes it helps to worship alongside other people who are trying to figure out life just like you are." Wade watched her work, noticing the way she moved with particular care today, as if the morning had been emotionally significant. "You miss him," he said, and it wasn't a question. Alma's hands stilled for a moment over the vegetables she was chopping. "Every day, for the past 3 years," she said quietly, "but missing him isn't the same as being stuck in missing him, if that makes sense." Wade found himself genuinely curious about her story in a way he hadn't been curious about another person in years. "How long were you married?" 43 years, come this October," Alma said, resuming her chopping with steady strokes. "Met him at a church picnic when I was 26 and he was 28. He was the handsomest man I'd ever seen, and the most stubborn." "What changed his mind?" "About church, I mean." Alma glanced at him with a small smile. "I did, eventually. But it wasn't because I nagged him or made him feel guilty. It was because he saw how much peace I found there, especially during the hard times. When we lost our first baby." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "When we lost our first baby, he saw how the church family surrounded us with love and support, and he realized that faith isn't just about believing in something bigger than yourself. It's about belonging to something bigger than yourself." Wade felt something shift in his understanding of this woman he'd hired to cook his meals. Alma hadn't lived an easy life, hadn't been protected from loss and heartbreak by her gentle faith. She'd been tested by it, strengthened by it, but not spared from it. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. "About the baby." "Thank you," Alma said simply. "We were blessed with 3 healthy children after that, 2 boys and a girl, who gave us 7 grandchildren and more joy than 2 people had any right to expect." She moved to the cabinet and pulled out a worn church bulletin, yellowed with age and carefully preserved. "This is from Harold's memorial service," she said, handing it to Wade. "I keep it to remind myself that a life well lived leaves marks on other people's hearts." Wade looked at the bulletin, noting the faded photograph of a kind-faced man with gentle eyes and Alma's smile. The service had clearly been well attended. The bulletin listed pallbearers, honorary pallbearers, and a reception hosted by the entire congregation and community. He was loved, Wade observed. He was, Alma agreed. But more importantly, he knew how to love others. That's what I miss most, not just being loved by him, but watching him love everyone else. He had a gift for making people feel seen and valued. Wade thought about his own future memorial service, wondering if anyone would come beyond his lawyer and the ranch hands who depended on their jobs. The thought was sobering in a way that surprised him. "Is that why you took this job?" Wade asked. "To find a new way to take care of someone?" Alma considered the question carefully while she seasoned the roast she was preparing for lunch. "Partly," she said finally, "but mostly because I got tired of cooking for myself and eating alone. Food tastes better when it's shared, and a house feels more like a home when someone's waiting for you to come back to it." The observation hit Wade squarely in the chest. "Even someone like me." Alma looked at him directly, her blue eyes serious but kind. "Especially someone like you. You've been taking care of this land and these cattle and this business for years, but nobody's been taking care of you. That's not sustainable, Mr. Langston. A person can't give what they don't have, and you can't have peace and contentment if you never let yourself receive them." Wade felt exposed again, but this time it didn't make him angry. It made him curious. "What made you think I was worth the effort?" "The way you talked about your grandmother's recipes," Alma said without hesitation. "A man who can remember love like that, who can miss it the way you clearly do, is a man who still has the capacity for it. You're not broken, Mr. Langston. You're just out of practice." That afternoon, Wade found himself thinking about Alma's words while he rode the fence line on his favorite horse. Out of practice. It was a gentler diagnosis than the ones he'd given himself over the years. Damaged, impossible to love, better off alone. Out of practice suggested that love was a skill that could be relearned, a muscle that could be strengthened with use. When he returned to the house for dinner, Alma had set the table with his grandmother's good china, something that had been packed away in boxes for 15 years. The dining room glowed with candlelight, and the smell of pot roast filled the air with warmth and promise. "I thought it was time these dishes saw some use," Alma said simply. "Beautiful things are meant to be enjoyed, not hidden away." Wade looked at the carefully set table, at Alma's expectant face, and realized she wasn't just talking about dishes. 2 weeks into Alma's employment, Wade noticed the small wooden cross she'd placed on the kitchen windowsill above the sink. It was maybe 4 inches tall, carved from what looked like pine and worn smooth from years of handling. The wood had darkened with age to a rich honey color, and the simple design spoke of patient craftsmanship rather than factory production. Wade first saw it on a Tuesday morning when he came down early for coffee and found Alma already at work preparing breakfast, humming her usual melody while she moved between stove and counter. The cross caught the morning light streaming through the window, and something about its quiet presence made Wade pause. "That's new," he said, nodding toward the windowsill. Alma glanced over and smiled. "I hope you don't mind. I know not everyone is comfortable with religious symbols, but it belonged to my Harold. He carved it for me during our 2nd year of marriage, when money was tight, and he couldn't afford to buy me anything fancy for my birthday." Wade moved closer to examine the cross, noting the careful attention to detail despite its simple design. The wood had been sanded smooth and shaped with obvious care, and tiny initials were carved into the base HW. For AW 1982. He made this himself? "Harold was a carpenter by trade before we married," Alma said, turning bacon in the skillet with practiced ease. "Said he learned more about patience and precision from working with wood than from any sermon he ever heard. He used to say that God spoke to him through his hands when he was creating something beautiful from rough lumber." Wade found himself studying the cross with new interest. He'd never been comfortable with religious displays, too many memories of his mother's desperate prayers for patience and his father's bitter complaints about sanctimonious church folk. But this simple piece of wood felt different somehow, less like a judgment and more like a reminder. "It doesn't bother you?" Alma asked, and Wade realized she'd been watching his reaction carefully. "No," Wade said, surprised to discover he meant it. "It's beautiful, peaceful." Alma's smile was radiant. "That's exactly what Harold intended. He said faith shouldn't be something that makes people uncomfortable or defensive. It should be something that offers comfort and hope, especially in dark times." Over the following days, Wade found his eyes drawn to the small cross during their morning conversations. There was something centering about its presence, a quiet reminder that some people found strength in believing they weren't facing life's challenges alone. Wade had never been able to embrace that kind of faith himself, too much evidence that prayers went unanswered and good people suffered regardless of their devotion. But watching Alma move through her daily routines with such gentle confidence, he began to understand that faith might be less about getting what you wanted and more about finding peace with what you received. The shift in their relationship became apparent on a Thursday evening when a sudden spring storm knocked out power to the ranch. Wade came in from checking on the generators to find Alma lighting candles throughout the kitchen, transforming the modern space into something intimate and warm. "I found these in the pantry," she said, arranging the last of the candles on the windowsill beside Harold's cross. "Seemed like a good night for candlelight anyway." They ate dinner by the soft glow of flickering flames, and for the first time since Alma had arrived, Wade found himself talking freely about his day. The pregnant heifer who'd finally delivered healthy twins, the new irrigation system that was working better than expected, the contract negotiation that had gone in his favor. Small things, daily details he'd never thought worth sharing with another person. "You love this land," Alma observed, refilling his coffee cup from the pot she'd kept warm on the wood-burning stove. "It's all I've ever known," Wade said, then paused. "No, that's not true. It's what I chose when everything else fell apart. There's a difference between choosing something and hiding in it." Wade looked across the candlelit table at Alma's kind face, noting how the warm light softened her features and made her seem less like an employee and more like what? A friend? A confidant? Something he couldn't quite name, but had been missing for longer than he cared to admit. "Maybe I started out hiding," he admitted. "But somewhere along the way, it became real. This place, this work, it's the only thing that's never let me down." "Land is faithful that way," Alma said. "It responds to care and attention without judgment or conditions. But it can't love you back, Mr. Langston. It can't offer comfort when you're grieving or celebration when you're happy. It can't grow old with you or forgive your mistakes or make you laugh when you need it most." Wade felt the familiar defensive response rising in his chest, but it was weaker now, diluted by weeks of Alma's gentle presence and honest observations. "Love is a luxury I can't afford," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to himself. "Love isn't a luxury," Alma said firmly. "It's a necessity. Like air and water and food, you can survive without it for a while, but eventually the lack of it will kill something essential in you." The power came back on suddenly, flooding the kitchen with artificial light and breaking the intimate spell of candlelight and honest conversation. Wade felt the loss immediately, the way the harsh fluorescence made the space feel cold and institutional again. "Leave them off," Alma said quietly, understanding his expression. "The candles are nicer." So they finished dinner in the warm glow of candlelight, and Wade found himself reluctant to end the evening. When Alma finally began clearing the dishes, he helped her carry them to the sink, the first time since she'd arrived that he'd participated in the domestic rituals that marked the end of each day. "Mr. Langston," Alma said as she began washing the dishes by hand, the small cross catching the candlelight above them, "would you consider something for me?" "What's that?" "Sunday dinner with Pastor Williams and his wife." Nothing fancy, just a simple meal with good people who'd like to know you better. Wade's first instinct was to refuse, to retreat behind the professional boundaries he'd worked so hard to maintain. But standing in the candlelit kitchen with Alma's patient presence beside him and Harold's cross keeping quiet watch over them both, he found himself saying words that surprised him. "I'll think about it." And for the first time in 25 years, Wade meant it when he said he'd consider opening his door to people who might want to know him for reasons that had nothing to do with his money or his land. The bundle of letters was tied with a faded blue ribbon and tucked carefully in the bottom drawer of Alma's small dresser in the apartment above the garage. Wade knew this because she'd brought them down to the kitchen on a quiet Saturday afternoon, setting them on the table with the same reverence she showed Harold's cross. "I want to share something with you," she said, her voice softer than usual, "but only if you're willing to listen to an old woman's love story." Wade had been reviewing quarterly reports at the kitchen table, but he set aside his paperwork without hesitation. Over the past month, he'd learned to recognize the moments when Alma offered glimpses into her heart, and he'd come to treasure them more than he cared to admit. "Harold wrote me a letter every week for the first 2 years we were married," Alma said, carefully untying the ribbon. "Even when we were living in the same house, even when we saw each other every day. He said love deserved to be written down, preserved, so it could be remembered during the hard times." She selected a letter from the middle of the stack, the envelope yellowed with age and addressed in careful masculine handwriting to Mrs. Alma Whitfield, most beautiful woman in Montana. Wade couldn't help but smile at the formal address, combined with the romantic sentiment. "This one," he wrote, "during our 3rd year of marriage, when I was carrying our second baby, the one we lost," Alma said, her voice steady but touched with old sorrow. "I was frightened about losing another child, and Harold was working extra hours trying to save money for the doctor bills. We were both scared and exhausted, barely talking to each other because we didn't want to voice our fears out loud." She handed Wade the letter, and he noticed her hands weren't quite steady. Would you mind reading it aloud? Sometimes it helps to hear his words in another voice." Wade unfolded the fragile paper carefully, noting the date, the 15th of March, 1985, and Harold's neat script covering both sides of the page. He cleared his throat and began to read. "My dearest Alma, I know we haven't been talking much these past weeks, both of us afraid to say what we're thinking, both of us trying to be strong for the other. But I need you to know that whatever happens with this baby, whatever God has planned for our family, I will love you through it. I will love you through the fear and the uncertainty and whatever grief might come. I will love you if we have 10 children or if we have none. I will love you when you're sick and when you're well, when you're confident and when you're frightened, when you're laughing and when you're crying." Wade paused, struck by the raw honesty of Harold's words. This wasn't flowery romantic poetry. This was a man making promises in the face of real uncertainty, offering comfort in the middle of genuine fear. "Go on," Alma said quietly. "You asked me yesterday if I ever regret marrying you, if I ever wish I'd found someone easier to love. Alma, loving you isn't work, it's privilege. Taking care of you isn't burden, it's purpose. Building a life with you isn't compromise, it's the best decision I ever made. You are my safe harbor in every storm, my celebration in every joy, my partner in every challenge. If this baby comes safely, we'll raise him or her with all the love we have. If this baby doesn't make it, we'll grieve together and heal together and trust that God's plan is bigger than our understanding." Wade's voice caught slightly as he continued reading Harold's promise to love Alma through whatever came next, to build their happiness on the foundation of their commitment to each other, rather than on circumstances they couldn't control. "I know you're scared, my darling girl. I'm scared too. But I'm not scared of losing you, because I know that what we have is stronger than fear, stronger than loss, stronger than whatever challenges we'll face. I choose you every morning when I wake up, and I'll keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life. All my love, Always, Harold. Wade folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Alma, who was wiping tears from her cheeks with quiet dignity. "We lost that baby 3 weeks later," she said. "But Harold kept his promise. He loved me through the grief, held me when I cried, never once made me feel like my sadness was too much for him to bear. That's what real love looks like, Mr. Langston, not the butterflies and romance kind they show in movies, but the everyday choice to be present for someone else's pain as well as their joy." Wade sat quietly for a long moment, processing what he'd just read. Harold's words had painted a picture of love that was completely foreign to Wade's experience. Love as steadiness rather than passion, love as commitment rather than feeling, love as a daily decision rather than a lightning strike. "I've never," Wade began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. "You've never experienced that kind of love," Alma said gently, "and it wasn't a question." "I've never believed it existed," Wade admitted. "In my experience, love always comes with conditions. People stay as long as you're useful, as long as you make them happy, as long as it's convenient. The moment things get difficult or complicated, they find reasons to leave." Alma was quiet for a moment, carefully retying the blue ribbon around Harold's letters. "That's not love," she said finally. "That's transaction. Love is what Harold offered me in this letter, the promise to stay regardless of outcome, to choose each other through the uncertainty and the fear and the loss." Wade thought about his parents, about his father's bitter accusations and his mother's dramatic departure, about his 3 failed engagements, each one ending when the women realized that his wealth couldn't compensate for his emotional unavailability, about the careful distance he maintained with everyone in his life, employees and business partners, and even Miguel, who'd been more loyal than family. "I don't know if I'm capable of that," Wade said, honestly. "You're more capable than you think," Alma replied. "I've watched you with your cattle, with your land, with Miguel and the other hands. You know how to be steady and reliable when something depends on you. The only difference with love is learning to trust that the other person will be steady and reliable too." Wade looked at the bundle of letters, at the physical evidence of Harold and Alma's enduring partnership. "Do you miss him every day?" "Every day," Alma said without hesitation. "But I'm grateful every day too, for the 43 years we had together, for the love we built, for the way he taught me what commitment really means. Missing him isn't the same as regretting him." That evening, Wade found himself thinking about Harold's letter while he made his final rounds of the ranch. What would it feel like to love someone with that kind of certainty, that daily choice to stay and build and commit regardless of circumstances? What would it feel like to be loved that way in return? For the first time in his adult life, Wade allowed himself to wonder if such love might be possible for him, not the desperate need he'd felt for his mother's approval or the conditional affection he'd received from the women who'd wanted his money more than his heart, but the steady, chosen, daily love that Harold had promised Alma in faded ink on yellowed paper. Wade had been in Denver for 3 days, negotiating a complex land acquisition that would expand the ranch by another 5,000 acres. The deal was important enough to require his personal attention, but for the first time in his business career, he found himself eager to finish the meetings and return home. The hotel room felt sterile and unwelcoming compared to his kitchen, with Alma humming over breakfast preparations, and even the finest restaurants in the city couldn't match the satisfaction of sharing one of his grandmother's recipes with someone who understood their significance. He'd called the ranch each evening, ostensibly to check on operations, but really to hear Alma's voice as she updated him on small domestic details, the new herb garden she'd planted, the pie she'd baked for Miguel's birthday, the way the morning light looked different now that she'd cleaned the windows properly. Their conversations had become the highlight of his days, and Wade found himself looking forward to them with an anticipation that surprised him. When he pulled into the ranch driveway late Thursday afternoon, Wade felt the familiar sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with the house itself and everything to do with knowing Alma would be there to welcome him back. The kitchen window glowed with warm light, and he could see her silhouette moving purposefully as she prepared what he hoped would be another memorable dinner. But something was wrong. Wade could sense it before he even reached the front door, a stillness in the air, a quality of light that seemed dimmed despite the sunset, painting the mountains in brilliant orange and gold. When he entered the kitchen, Alma looked up from the stove with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and Wade felt his stomach clench with sudden anxiety. "Welcome home," she said, but her voice lacked its usual warmth. "How did the meetings go?" "Fine," Wade said, studying her face with growing concern. Alma looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, and there was something fragile about the way she moved, as if she were being careful with herself. "Is everything all right?" "Of course," Alma said, turning back to the stove with movements that seemed deliberately casual. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Why don't you go upstairs and change out of that suit?" Wade hesitated, every instinct telling him that Alma was hiding something important. But she'd turned away from him, effectively ending the conversation, so he reluctantly headed upstairs to change clothes and wash off 3 days of city dust and hotel air conditioning. When he returned to the kitchen, Alma had set the table with his grandmother's china again, but the usual care seemed forced, as if she were going through familiar motions without her usual attention to detail. They ate in relative silence, Wade trying unsuccessfully to draw her into conversation, while Alma offered polite responses that revealed nothing about whatever was troubling her. It wasn't until he was helping her clear the dishes, a routine they'd established over the past month, that Wade noticed the small overnight bag sitting by the back door, partially hidden behind Alma's everyday purse. "Going somewhere?" he asked, nodding toward the bag. Alma's hands stilled over the dish she was drying. For a moment, she didn't respond, and Wade felt his chest tighten with a familiar fear, the same sensation he'd experienced as a 12-year-old watching his mother pack her suitcases with methodical determination. "I need to go into town for a few days," Alma said finally, not meeting his eyes. "There are some things I need to take care of." "What kind of things?" Wade pressed, hearing the edge in his own voice and hating how desperate he sounded. "Personal business," Alma replied, still not looking at him. "Nothing you need to worry about." But Wade was already worrying, his mind racing through possibilities. Had he said something wrong? Done something to make her uncomfortable? Was this about money, about the isolation of the ranch, about the growing intimacy of their conversations? He'd thought their relationship was deepening into something like friendship, maybe even family, but perhaps he'd misread the signals entirely. "How long will you be gone?" Wade asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I'm not sure," Alma said, and something in her tone made Wade look at her more carefully. Her hands were shaking slightly as she folded the dish towel, and there was a quality to her careful composure that reminded him of someone trying very hard not to fall apart. "Alma," Wade said gently, moving to where she stood by the sink, "what's really going on?" For a moment, he thought she might tell him. Her mouth opened slightly, and her eyes filled with unshed tears. But then she seemed to catch herself, straightening her shoulders and forcing another unconvincing smile. "It's nothing for you to be concerned about," she said. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Wade felt frustration building in his chest, mixed with hurt and a growing sense of panic. After weeks of honest conversation and increasing trust, Alma was shutting him out completely, treating him like the employer he'd started as, instead of the what had he become to her? What had she become to him? "You're leaving tonight?" Wade asked, noticing that Alma was wearing her good dress and that her small suitcase looked packed and ready. "Yes, I've called a taxi. It should be here any minute." The casual efficiency of her departure plans hit Wade like a physical blow. She'd arranged everything without consulting him, made decisions about leaving without even telling him until he'd noticed her bag. The careful distance in her voice suggested this wasn't a temporary absence, but something more permanent, more final. "Are you coming back?" Wade asked bluntly. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Alma's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she pressed one hand to her mouth as if trying to hold back words that wanted to escape. "I don't know," she whispered, and the honesty of it was worse than any lie would have been. Wade felt the familiar walls slamming back into place around his heart, the old defense mechanisms clicking into position with practiced ease. Of course, she was leaving. Of course, the warmth and connection and growing sense of family had been temporary. People always left, eventually, and the only surprise was that he'd allowed himself to hope this time might be different. But even through his hurt and anger, Wade could see that Alma was in pain too. Whatever was driving her away wasn't indifference or boredom or the desire for something better. She looked like someone being forced to amputate a treasured limb to save her life, necessary but devastating. "Tell me what's wrong," Wade said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Whatever it is, maybe I can help." Alma shook her head, wiping tears from her cheeks with trembling fingers. "You can't help with this." "No one can." Outside, a car horn honked softly. The taxi had arrived. Alma picked up her suitcase and purse, moving toward the door with the painful determination of someone doing something they hated but believed was necessary. Wade followed her, his mind racing for words that might change her mind, arguments that might convince her to stay and trust him with whatever burden she was carrying. At the door, Alma turned back to look at him one last time. Her eyes were bright with tears, and her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. "Thank you for letting me be part of your home for a while," she said. "It meant more to me than you'll ever know." Wade watched her walk to the waiting taxi, her small figure silhouetted against the evening sky. She didn't look back as the car pulled away, carrying her down the gravel drive and out of sight beyond the cottonwood trees that lined the property. Standing alone in his kitchen for the first time in 6 weeks, Wade felt the silence press against him like a living thing. The dirty dishes sat abandoned in the sink, Harold's cross caught the last light from the window, and his grandmother's recipe book lay open on the counter to a page marked with Alma's neat handwriting. Wade closed the book and put it back in the cabinet where he'd stored it for 15 years. Tomorrow, he'd call an agency in Billings and hire another cook. Someone professional and distant who understood that this was a business arrangement, nothing more. Someone who wouldn't hum while they worked or share stories of lasting love, or make him believe that loneliness might be curable. Someone who couldn't leave him because they'd never really arrived. Wade lasted exactly 18 hours before he broke. He'd spent Friday morning trying to fall back into his old routine: black coffee from the machine, cereal from a box, silence that felt more like suffocation than peace. The kitchen seemed to mock him with its recent transformation, every clean surface and organized cabinet a reminder of Alma's presence. Harold's cross still sat on the windowsill, and Wade found himself staring at it while his coffee grew cold, wondering if faith was supposed to feel this much like heartbreak. By afternoon, he couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. Wade drove into Bridgewater, the small town where Alma attended church, determined to find answers, even if he had to ask uncomfortable questions of near strangers. Pastor Williams was his first stop. If anyone knew where Alma had gone and why, it would be the kind-faced minister who'd been asking about Wade for weeks. The church was a simple white building with a wooden cross mounted above double doors that looked like they'd welcomed generations of worshippers through joys and sorrows alike. Wade sat in his truck for 5 minutes, gathering courage he hadn't needed since he was a boy, before finally walking up the front steps and knocking. Pastor Williams answered the door himself, a man in his 60s with gentle eyes and hands that spoke of honest work alongside his calling. His face lit up with recognition and something that might have been relief. "Wade Langston," he said, extending a firm handshake. "I've been hoping to meet you properly. Miss Alma has spoken of you often." "That's why I'm here," Wade said, getting straight to the point, because small talk felt impossible when his chest was tight with worry. She left yesterday evening, and I need to know if she's all right. Pastor William's expression shifted to concern, and he stepped aside to let Wade enter the small office behind the sanctuary. The room smelled of old books and furniture polish, and the walls were lined with photographs of church gatherings spanning decades, baptisms and weddings, and community dinners where people looked genuinely happy to be together. "She didn't tell you where she was going?" Pastor Williams asked, settling into a chair across from Wade with the careful attention of someone accustomed to counseling people through crisis. "She said she had personal business to take care of," Wade replied. "But something was wrong. She looked scared, and she wasn't sure if she was coming back." Pastor Williams was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap while he seemed to weigh what he could and couldn't share. "Wade, I'm going to tell you something in confidence, and I'm trusting you to handle it with the same care Alma would." Wade's stomach clenched with dread. "Is she sick?" 3 weeks ago, Alma came to me after receiving some test results from her doctor," Pastor Williams said gently. "There were some abnormal findings that required additional testing. She went back to Billings yesterday for what she hoped would be the final round of examinations." Wade felt the world tilt sideways. "Cancer? Possibly. The doctors aren't certain yet, but they needed to rule out several serious possibilities." Pastor Williams leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying decades of experience with delivering difficult news. "Alma was terrified, Wade. Not of the diagnosis itself, but of what it might mean for the people who've come to depend on her. She was worried about me," Wade said, understanding flooding through him with sickening clarity. "She spoke of you like family," Pastor Williams confirmed. "Said you'd been alone too long already, that the last thing you needed was to watch another person you cared about face an uncertain future." Wade thought about Harold's letters, about Alma's stories of love that endured through loss and fear and uncertainty. She'd been trying to protect him from exactly the kind of situation Harold had written about, the choice to love someone through their darkest moments instead of running from the possibility of pain. "Where is she now?" Wade asked. "The Billings Medical Center. She's staying at the hotel across the street until the tests are complete." Pastor Williams handed Wade a piece of paper with the hotel's name and address written in careful script. "Wade, I need you to understand something. Alma made the decision to face this alone because she loves you enough to spare you the burden of her uncertainty. That's not her choice to make," Wade said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. Pastor Williams smiled for the first time since Wade had arrived. "I was hoping you'd say that." The drive to Billings took 3 hours, and Wade spent every minute of it remembering fragments of conversation with Alma, looking for signs he should have noticed. Her careful movements the past week, the way she'd seemed to be savoring their morning talks as if storing them up for future remembering, the extra effort she'd put into using his grandmother's china and creating moments of connection he'd treasured without understanding their urgency. The Bridgewater Hotel was exactly the kind of place Alma would choose, clean and modest, with a lobby that tried too hard to be cheerful, and a front desk clerk who looked like she'd seen every possible variation of human crisis. Wade's hands shook as he asked for Alma's room number, and he was grateful when the clerk simply nodded and pointed toward the elevators without asking questions about his relationship to the guest or his right to visit. Wade stood outside room 247 for a full minute before knocking, trying to find words that would make sense of his presence without making Alma feel guilty for her decision to face this alone. When she opened the door, her face cycled through surprise, joy, and something that looked like shame before settling into resigned acceptance. "You talked to Pastor Williams," she said, stepping aside to let him enter the small room. "I was worried about you," Wade replied, taking in the neat arrangement of her few belongings and the medical paperwork spread across the small table by the window. "I couldn't just let you disappear without knowing you were safe." Alma sat heavily in the room's single chair, suddenly looking every one of her 70 years. "I didn't want you to have to go through this. You've lost enough people already. Wade pulled the desk chair closer to where she sat and took her hands in his, noting how fragile they felt despite their lifetime of capable work. "Alma, do you remember what Harold wrote to you about loving through fear and uncertainty?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. "That's different. We were married. We had made promises to each other." "And what do you think these past 2 months have been?" Wade asked gently. "We may not have stood up in a church or signed papers, but we've been building something real, something that matters. You said love is a daily choice, remember? Well, I'm choosing to be here. I'm choosing to face whatever comes next alongside you, instead of letting you face it alone." Alma looked at him through her tears, and Wade could see the moment when her careful protective walls began to crumble. "The tests should be finished tomorrow afternoon," she whispered. "The doctor will have results by Monday. Then we'll wait together," Wade said simply. "And whatever the results are, we'll deal with them together. What if it's bad news? What if the treatment is difficult or doesn't work? Or, then we'll take it one day at a time." Wade interrupted, remembering Harold's words about love being stronger than circumstances. "I'm not going anywhere, Alma. You taught me what family really means, and family doesn't abandon each other when things get scary." That evening, Wade moved his things to the room next door and took Alma to dinner at a small restaurant near the hospital. They talked about everything except the medical tests, about the ranch, about improvements Wade wanted to make to the kitchen, about the Sunday dinners with Pastor Williams that Wade was now genuinely looking forward to. For the first time since she'd left, Alma laughed at something Wade said, and the sound filled him with more relief than he'd felt since childhood. Saturday passed slowly, filled with nervous energy and attempts at normal conversation. Wade read aloud from a book of poetry Alma had brought, his voice stumbling over verses about love and time and the preciousness of ordinary moments. Alma taught him to play gin rummy, and Wade discovered he had a competitive streak that made her laugh despite her anxiety. That night, sleeping in the hotel room next to Alma's, Wade found himself praying for the first time since he was a boy, not to a God he was sure was listening, but to whatever force in the universe might be willing to give him more time with the woman who'd taught him that love wasn't just possible, it was essential. Sunday morning brought Alma's soft knock on his door at dawn. When Wade answered, she was fully dressed and carrying 2 cups of coffee from the lobby. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply, "and I didn't want to be alone anymore." They sat together in Wade's room as the sun rose over Billings, drinking bad coffee and holding hands while Alma talked about her fears and Wade made promises he hoped he'd be able to keep. By the time they needed to leave for the hospital, Wade understood that whatever the test results revealed, his life had already changed irrevocably. He'd chosen love over self-protection, chosen presence over safety, chosen to trust that some things were worth the risk of loss. As they walked through the hospital doors together, Wade felt Harold's words echoing in his mind. Love is what you choose each other through. Today, he was choosing Alma through whatever came next, and for the first time in his adult life, that choice felt like courage rather than foolishness. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Wade and Alma sat in the hospital waiting room, surrounded by other people facing their own uncertain futures, all of them united in the particular kind of anxiety that comes with waiting for news that could change everything. Alma wore her Sunday dress and had taken extra care with her hair, as if meeting bad news properly dressed might somehow lessen its impact. Wade noticed she'd removed her wedding ring for the first time since he'd known her not carelessly, but deliberately, placing it in the small velvet pouch she kept in her purse alongside Harold's final letter. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly, her hands folded in her lap with the same composed dignity she brought to everything else. "Before we go in there, before we hear whatever the doctor has to say." Wade felt his chest tighten, but he nodded for her to continue. "Harold and I always said we'd know when it was time," Alma said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Time to stop fighting, time to let go, time to say the things that mattered most." We promised each other we wouldn't be selfish about it, wouldn't hold on past the point where holding on was about our own fear instead of genuine hope. Alma, let me finish, she said gently. I removed my ring this morning because regardless of what the doctor tells us, my life has already changed. These past 2 months with you have shown me something I thought was finished when Harold died. The possibility of new love, different love, but love nonetheless. Wade felt something crack open in his chest, a sensation both painful and liberating. What are you saying? I'm saying that if the news is good, if I have years ahead of me, I want to spend them building something real with you. Not as your employee, not as someone taking care of you out of obligation, but as chosen family. And if the news is bad, her voice caught slightly, but she pressed on with characteristic determination. If the news is bad, I want whatever time I have left to be spent with someone who loves me enough to let me face it honestly. Wade took her hands, feeling the absence of Harold's ring like a physical presence between them. Are you asking me to marry you, Alma Whitfield? Alma's laugh was watery but genuine. I suppose I am, in my own backwards way, though I was thinking less about marriage and more about adoption. Adoption? You need a family, Wade Langston, and I need a son who'll remember me fondly when I'm gone. Legal adoption might sound silly to some people, a 70-year-old woman and a 52-year-old man, but it would give us what we've both been missing: official belonging, legal next of kin, the right to make medical decisions for each other if needed. Wade stared at her, processing an offer he'd never imagined receiving. In all his fantasies about love and connection, he'd never considered the possibility of chosen family that bypassed romance entirely and went straight to the bedrock of commitment, the decision to claim each other permanently, legally, publicly. You want to adopt me as your son? I want us to adopt each other, Alma corrected. Montana allows adult adoption when both parties consent and there's clear benefit to the relationship. We'd be each other's legal family, each other's emergency contact, each other's inheritance. Wade thought about the grandfather clock in his foyer, about his grandmother's recipes, about 30,000 acres of Montana land that would someday need an heir who understood its value. He thought about growing old in the big house that had been empty for so long, about having someone to share holiday dinners and difficult decisions and the small daily victories that meant nothing when experienced alone. Mrs. Langston, he said finally, testing the sound of it. Mr. Langston, Alma replied, her smile radiant despite her tears. Before Wade could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Whitfield, Dr. Martinez is ready to see you. Wade started to stand, but Alma caught his hand. Together, she said firmly. Whatever we're about to hear, we hear it as family. Doctor. Martinez was a kind-faced woman in her 40s who invited them to sit before delivering news that would reshape their understanding of the future. The test results were mixed, not the clear positive or negative they'd hoped for, but something more complex that would require ongoing monitoring and possible treatment. There are abnormal cells, Doctor, Martinez explained, but they're not aggressive and they may never become problematic. We'll need to check every 3 months initially, then every 6 months if things remain stable. This is something we can manage, Mrs. Whitfield. Something you can live with for many years, if we stay vigilant. Wade felt the breath he'd been holding for 3 days finally release. Exactly the kind of uncertain middle ground that would require the daily choice Harold had written about the decision to build a life together despite not knowing what the future would bring. So we'll take it one day at a time, Alma said, squeezing Wade's hand. We will, Wade agreed, understanding that the we had just become official, legal, permanent in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the deeper bonds of chosen family. Walking out of the hospital that afternoon, Wade felt lighter than he had since childhood, not because the future was certain it never would be, but because he wouldn't have to face it alone. 6 months later, Wade stood in his kitchen, watching Alma arrange flowers from her expanded garden in his grandmother's crystal vase. The legal papers, making them officially family, were framed and hanging in the hallway, where the dusty photograph of his parents had once hidden a testament to new beginnings built on the foundation of old love. The adoption ceremony had been simple and perfect. Pastor Williams had performed an informal blessing in the church where Alma had found comfort for decades, with Miguel and his wife serving as witnesses, and half the town of Bridgewater turning out to celebrate the unusual but obviously loving family bond between the wealthy rancher and the gentle woman who'd become his chosen mother. Wade's lawyer had been initially skeptical about the adoption request, questioning whether there might be financial motivations behind the arrangement. But watching Wade and Alma interact during the legal consultations, the way they deferred to each other's wisdom, the obvious affection and respect between them, the careful consideration they gave to decisions that would affect them both, had convinced even the most cynical observers that this was genuine family formation, not convenience or opportunism. The medical monitoring had become routine rather than terrifying. Every 3 months, Wade drove Alma to Billings for checkups that continued to show stable, manageable results. Her health remained good, her energy strong, and the shadow of uncertainty that had driven her away 6 months ago had transformed into the normal awareness of mortality that comes with age and wisdom. More importantly, their daily life had settled into rhythms that felt both natural and deeply satisfying. Wade had renovated the apartment above the garage into a proper suite with a small kitchen and sitting room, giving Alma independence while keeping her close enough for daily meals and evening conversations. She'd insisted on maintaining her own space. "A woman my age needs a place to retreat and think," she'd said, but the big house had become the center of their shared life. The transformation was most visible in the kitchen, which now served as the heart of not just their household, but an expanding circle of community connection. Pastor Williams and his wife had become regular Sunday dinner guests, followed by Miguel's family for monthly celebrations, then neighbors and church members who'd heard about the excellent meals and warm welcome available at the Langston Ranch. Wade had discovered he actually enjoyed entertaining when the focus was on genuine hospitality rather than business networking. Alma's gift for making people feel welcome, combined with his natural generosity to create gatherings that people talked about for weeks afterward. The big dining room that had sat empty for years now hosted birthday parties and holiday celebrations and impromptu dinners for anyone who seemed to need good food and better company. "Are you ready for this?" Alma asked, adjusting the last flower in the arrangement and stepping back to admire her work. Wade looked through the window at the cars already beginning to arrive for what had become their biggest event yet, a celebration of Alma's 70th birthday and their 6-month family anniversary. What had started as a quiet dinner for a few close friends had grown into a community gathering that would fill every room of the house with laughter and conversation. "I think so," Wade said, straightening his tie with hands that were steady despite his excitement. "Though I still can't believe this many people want to celebrate with us." Alma smiled and moved to adjust his collar with the familiar intimacy of family affection. "That's because you still don't understand how much you've changed. The man who hired me 6 months ago was successful and respected, but he wasn't loved. The man standing here now has opened his heart and his home to an entire community. Of course they want to celebrate that." Wade thought about the transformation Alma described, still amazed by how different his life felt with family at its center. The ranch operations hadn't changed significantly. He was still successful, still wealthy, still respected in business circles. But his personal life had been revolutionized by the simple presence of someone who cared about his daily happiness, someone who noticed when he was tired or worried or pleased with himself. "I have something for you," Wade said, reaching into his jacket pocket for the small wrapped package he'd been carrying all day. Alma opened the gift carefully, revealing a wooden jewelry box that Wade had spent weeks crafting in the workshop he'd set up in one of the unused barns. The wood was the same honey-colored pine that Harold had used for his cross, and Wade had carved their names and the date of their adoption into the lid with the same careful attention to detail that Harold had shown in his own woodworking. Inside the box, nestled in blue velvet, was a simple gold locket containing a picture of them together on adoption day. Wade in his best suit and Alma in the blue dress she'd worn to their first interview, both of them grinning with the joy of people who'd found what they'd been searching for without knowing they were looking. "Wade," Alma whispered, tears gathering in her eyes, "it's beautiful. You taught me that love is something you build with your hands as much as your heart," Wade said, helping her fasten the locket around her neck. "I wanted to give you something that showed how grateful I am for the family we've created together." Through the window, they could see more cars arriving, friends and neighbors, ready to celebrate the unlikely family that had brought new life to both the big house and the community around it. But for this moment, Wade and Alma stood together in their transformed kitchen, wearing the physical symbols of their chosen love and ready to welcome the world into the home they'd built from scratch. 1 year after Alma had first knocked on his front door with her worn suitcase and gentle eyes, Wade stood in the same kitchen where their story had begun, putting the finishing touches on his greatest creation yet. The wooden recipe box sat on the counter, its honey-colored pine surface glowing in the morning light that streamed through windows that sparkled with Alma's care. Wade had spent 3 months crafting the box in his workshop, learning woodworking techniques from YouTube videos and trial-and-error experimentation that would have made Harold proud. The corners were perfectly joined, the lid fitted with precision hinges that opened and closed with satisfying smoothness, and the interior was lined with blue velvet that matched the locket he'd given Alma for her birthday. Inside the box were 2 distinct collections of recipes. The first section contained careful copies of his grandmother's original recipes, each one transcribed in Wade's improving handwriting with notes about family memories and special occasions. The second section held new recipes that he and Alma had created together over the past year, variations on old favorites, seasonal dishes that showcased Alma's garden produce, and the special meal preparations they'd developed for their expanding circle of dinner guests. But the recipe box was more than just a collection of cooking instructions. It was a physical representation of the family legacy they were building together, a tangible symbol of how new traditions could grow from the roots of old love. Wade had carved both their names into the lid along with the date of their first meeting, creating an heirloom that would someday tell the story of how 2 lonely people had chosen to become family. "Is it finished?" Alma asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway with her usual perfect timing. She'd developed an instinct for knowing when Wade was working on something special, and her ability to arrive at just the right moment never failed to amaze him. "Just finished the last coat of varnish yesterday," Wade replied, stepping aside so she could examine his handiwork. "What do you think?" Alma ran her fingers over the smooth wood, tracing the carved letters with the reverence she showed for all meaningful objects. When she opened the lid, her breath caught at the sight of the organized recipe cards, each one representing hours of shared cooking, conversation, and the quiet joy of creating something beautiful together. "Wade," she said softly, lifting one of the new recipe cards they'd created for their famous Sunday pot roast, a dish that combined his grandmother's technique with Alma's seasoning innovations. "This is incredible. It's not just a recipe box, it's our history. Our legacy," Wade corrected, moving to stand beside her as they looked through the carefully organized collection. "For whoever comes after us, so they'll know that good food and genuine love were the foundations of this family." Alma selected a card from the back of the box, one that Wade had added just that morning. It was titled Alma's Healing Soup and included not just ingredients and instructions, but a note about the soup's origin, created during Alma's first week of uncertainty about her health, when Wade needed to learn how to take care of someone he loved, best served with reassurance and the promise that no one faces difficult times alone. "You remember everything," Alma said, tears gathering in her eyes as she read Wade's careful documentation of their shared experiences. The important things, Wade replied, the moments that mattered, the times when we chose each other. They stood together in comfortable silence, the morning light warming their faces as they contemplated the year that had transformed them both from isolated individuals into a family unit that had become the center of an ever-widening circle of community and love. The changes weren't just emotional. The ranch itself reflected their partnership. Alma's gardens provided fresh vegetables for their table and flowers for their home, while Wade's business decisions increasingly considered not just profitability, but their impact on the community of employees and neighbors who'd become part of their extended family. Miguel had been promoted to full ranch manager, giving him both greater responsibility and the security of knowing his position was safe, regardless of Wade's personal circumstances. The big house had been transformed from a showcase of wealth into a genuine home where people gathered for celebration, comfort, and the simple pleasure of good company. Every room bore evidence of shared life books that had been read aloud on quiet evenings, photographs from community gatherings, and the comfortable clutter that accumulates when a house is actually lived in rather than simply occupied. "I have something to tell you," Alma said, closing the recipe box and turning to face Wade with an expression that was both serious and joyful. "I got the results from yesterday's medical checkup." Wade felt his breath catch, even though these quarterly appointments had become routine and the news had been consistently positive. Some fears, he'd learned, never completely disappeared. They just became manageable. "Everything's stable," Alma continued, her smile widening. "Dr. Martinez said my numbers are actually better than they've been all year. She thinks the regular schedule and reduced stress might be contributing to improved overall health." Wade felt relief wash over him, followed immediately by gratitude for the life they'd built, together a life where Alma's well-being was supported by community, purpose, and the security of knowing she was loved regardless of circumstances. "So we keep taking it one day at a time," Wade said, echoing the phrase that had become their family motto. "We do," Alma agreed, then paused with the particular expression she wore when she was about to share something important. "But I was thinking we might start planning a little further ahead. Pastor Williams mentioned that the church needs a new fellowship hall, and I thought we might consider helping with the funding. Create a space where families like ours, the chosen ones, the ones that don't fit traditional patterns, can gather and celebrate." Wade looked at this remarkable woman who'd taught him that love was both a daily choice and a lifetime commitment, who'd shown him that family could be created through intention as much as birth, who'd transformed his empty house into a home and his isolated existence into a life worth living. "Mrs. Langston," he said, using the name that still filled him with wonder, "I think that's a perfect idea." Outside the kitchen window, the Montana sunrise painted the mountains in shades of gold and pink, promising another day of shared meals, quiet conversations, and the particular contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The recipe box sat on the counter between them, filled with the ingredients for a love that would nourish not just them, but everyone fortunate enough to be welcomed into the family they'd chosen to create together. Wade had been starving for love without knowing it, and Alma had fed his soul with exactly the nourishment he needed. Now, together, they were prepared to spend the rest of their days sharing that same sustenance with anyone else who needed to learn that family isn't just about blood, it's about the daily choice to care for each other, to stay present through uncertainty, and to create something beautiful from the simple decision to love.